Processing payments online is a daunting task, but Stripe API makes it very easy. In this video, I'll show you how you can use Stripe API with NextJs to build something like this. I have currently 2 products on my page, and you can add them to your cart and you can see the items in your shopping cart. You can remove them from your shopping cart, you can add them back in, and when you're ready, you can check out. That redirects you to Stripe, where you can fill out your information and pay for these products. So I'm going to use a dummy credit card over here that works with Stripe, and a name and a postal code. And finally, when you pay, you will be redirected back to a success page on our site that shows you a summary of what you have actually purchased, the product, the information or the card that you used to pay for it, and the information about the customer. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Hamed. I'm a full stack JavaScript developer, and on this channel, I'll teach you all about React, Svelte, and NextJs. So let's get into this. To get started, you can go to stripe.com and create an account. From there, go to your dashboard where you can define different products. As you can see, I have created some products here, and every product has a name, a description, and probably an image and some pricing. Now keep in mind that products in Stripe can have multiple prices, and generally speaking, Stripe works around prices more so than products. We're going to see this in action in a second. Now, once you have defined the products that you want, you can head to the developers tab, and from here, you need to grab these 2 API keys. One is the publishable key, which is your public API key for your client-side React code to connect to Stripe, and the other one is your secret key, which is your secret API key, which is used on the server side to again connect to Stripe. You bring these 2 values and create a .env.local file in the root directory of your project, and just copy and paste them here. Now notice that the Stripe publishable key is prefixed with next public. Anytime that you want to make an environment variable public or expose it to the client-side code, you can prefix it with next public in Next.js, and it will be accessible in your React code. Now the Stripe secret key is a regular environment variable, and it's only accessible on the server-side code. Once you brought in these 2 variables, you can go ahead and install 2 packages. One is the Stripe library, and the other one is the Stripe library for the client-side code, which is a wrapper around this Stripe package. I've already installed them, so I'm not going to install them again. Instead, I'm going to start a development server. Now, if I go back to my page, you can see this is the page that we started. I'm going to explain how we are rendering each and every of these pages and components and how we're communicating to Stripe. So let's start from our home page. Let me close these 2 so we have more room over here. Now this is my home page component. I am exporting an async function called getServerSideProps, which is where you can write server-side code in Next.js. And with the use of this Stripe package library that we just installed, I'm creating a new Stripe client by passing my secret API key. From there, I use that Stripe client to get a list of the active prices on my account. You can pass in some options, active true, which only brings in active prices, because in a Stripe you can deactivate a price, you can archive a price. I'm limiting the results to 10, and I'm expanding the data.product. And the reason for this is when we get the list of our price objects, they're going to only include a product ID, but I need more information on the product, such as their name, their description, and their image. So I'm expanding on it, basically telling Stripe to also give me the product objects linked to every price instead of just the product ID. Once I got these prices, I'm passing them to my homepage component. So I have access to this array of price objects. I'm going to then map over this array, and for every price object, I'm rendering this card component, which shows this cards. Now let's see what is the cart component. The cart component takes in the price object and obviously returns some JSX to show the details of that price product object, and also adds the functionality of us being able to add this specific item to our shopping cart. For the shopping cart, I'm using React context. So let me quickly show you that. Here I'm using the create context from React to create a cart context and then create a custom cart provider component that takes in a children prop and wraps that children prop with the cart context.provider from React. We pass in this object as the value that we want to be shared as our state, which holds this items, which is a local state for our shopping cart items. And I'm also exposing some functions like add item, remove item, and reset cart to work with our shopping cart. Now I've also created this custom hook, use cart, that all it does is that it uses the use context hook to subscribe to this cart context. So we can use this custom hook in any component that we want to subscribe to this context to use these values. And that's exactly what we are doing in the cart component. I'm calling this custom hook. From it, I'm getting my items and I'm getting this add item function so that I can hook it up to this button that enables me to add these items to my shopping cart. Now let's quickly look at the shopping cart there. To hold this layout and this logo, the heading and this shopping cart, I have added a layout component. And in the layout component, let me just close this off. In the layout component, we're having this header. So the header is this header you can see here. It consists of this logo and that shopping. Let me just open this up. So our header is just a header component with the links and this icon that we see over there. We are having this shopping cart slide over, which we're going to see in a second. We have our main content. This is the content of the page. And we have a footer, which is not even existing over here. Now for closing and opening this shopping cart slider, I'm holding this state in my layout that tells it if it is open or if it is closed. For this shopping cart slider, I'm using Tailwind CSS and specifically Tailwind UI, which are pre-built components using Tailwind CSS. It's an amazing library of different components you can use in your app. And for the animation, I'm using the headless UI, which is again from the Tailwind team with different types of components. Let's go back here. So all we're doing here in this shopping cart slider is we are getting some information about the items that we have here, pass them down as our products. We are also using this remove item from our cart context provider to hook it up to these buttons so that we can remove items from our shopping cart. And then at the end, when the user decides to check out, we have this checkout button, which is hooked. We just scroll down. So this is the link that we have hooked up with this handle checkout. And this handle checkout, all it does is that it calls a checkout function we have defined in our library. So let's see what that is. Now, what does this checkout function do? It receives the current items in our shopping cart and hits this endpoint, which is defined in our own backend. So if I go to pages/API Stripe, and then I'm going to have sessions and index.js, this is where this fetch is going. So let me close this off so we can see this side by side. So what are we doing? We are getting the items that's currently in our shopping cart, mapping over them. For each one, we're creating this object that has the price ID and the quantity. And we are passing those line items to our API endpoint. So we have created a Stripe sessions endpoint and passing this line items there. The idea is we're going to then, from our backend, using our secret API key, create a session in Stripe with these items that's sent to us from the client side, from our front end. And then once we have created that session in Stripe, we're going to redirect the user to that Stripe session for them to pay. Now let's see what's happening in this API. So in this API, we are expecting a post request. We are destructuring the line items out of the body. And we are creating a new Stripe client up there with the Stripe package that we have. Using that client, we're going to create a checkout session. This checkout session requires line items. What are the items in this checkout session? What is the mode? Is it payment? Is it subscription? What is the success URL? Where should I send the client back to when they've actually paid? And where should I send them if they canceled the payment? We're going to get back a session from this function, and we're going to send this session to our front end. So we send this session back to this checkout function. Now here we have this session. What do we want to do now that we have this session? We want to redirect the user to that session in Stripe so that they can continue processing the payment for the items that they selected in the shopping cart and we created a session on our backend. How do we redirect them there? Well, that's why we installed this Stripe client-side library, because now here we're on the client side. We're going to use that to load Stripe. So we have that client again. And to load Stripe on the client side, you're going to use your public API key, because now I'm on the client side. So I'm going to create this Stripe promise and await it to get the client, and I'm going to use the client to redirect to checkout. And to this function, I have to provide a session ID. Where do I get it from? Well, my backend, my API endpoint, returned this session so I can access the session ID on that session object. And with this, the user will be redirected to Stripe on a session with the line items that they've already selected on the client side. So let's actually go ahead to do this. If I hit checkout, I'll be redirected to the Stripe website, from where I can just put in some dummy information for now. 424242 is a testing credit card. Let's put a name and postal code. And when I go ahead and pay, I'll be redirected back to this success URL that I defined. What am I defining as my success URL? Well, I'm saying request headers at origin. That's my origin. And then I'm telling it to go to checkout success, and I'm telling it to give me the session ID. This curly braces here, Stripe will dynamically inject the session ID or the checkout session ID over here for me. Okay, so I'm redirecting the user to checkout success, and the session ID you can see here, it was inserted for me. So let's see what this page is doing now that we are redirecting the user back to this page. So I'm going to page, checkout, and success. Now, the idea is here that we want to extract this session ID from these query parameters in the URL that's sent to us from Stripe. And we want to retrieve the information from this session. So what we need to do, we need to again have another API endpoint of ourselves. So API Stripe sessions and session ID, where I can retrieve the information of this session from Stripe. Let's go to that API, and then I'll explain what's happening here. So in our APIs, I'm creating session ID. This is another endpoint which is expecting a GET request. It requires a session ID, and then using the Stripe client checkout sessions, this time it tries to retrieve the session with this session ID. I'm passing in some options to expand the payment intent, the line items that was in the session, the price and products. Once we get the information about that session, we're going to send that session to our client side. So let's go back to the success page. So once we are fetching this endpoint, which is our own endpoint, we're going to get the checkout session. How am I doing this? I'm using use SWR, which is a library that allows you to handle client-side data fetching in React or NextJS. It's built by the NextJS team, and I actually have a video on my channel talking about client-side data fetching using use SWR. You can check it out. It makes it easy to work or fetch data on the client side. Nevertheless, we are getting this session, we're retrieving this session that was completed from Stripe. We're just retrieving it from our own endpoint and passing it to the client side. Now I'm using this checkout session to extract the information about the order ID, about the product that was purchased, the payment method that was used, the customer information, the amount, so forth and so on. Now, if you notice here on my session, there was also this cancel URL, which is just request header origin, which just returns the user back to the home page, which is this page. So if I try this one more time, I'm adding this product to my shopping cart. I go checkout, and then the user maybe doesn't want to continue. They hit back, they cancel the payment, they come back to this page. But now notice that the shopping cart, even though the page reloaded, is still showing that product they had there. I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but in the shopping cart context provider, if I go to my context, just a quick note, I'm also writing these items or the content of the shopping cart to my local storage. So if the page reloads or if they cancel the payment and come back to the page, because I'm reading and writing this cart context to local storage, I'm able to retrieve what was inside of their cart. I know there's a lot going on, so let me summarize what exactly happened from the beginning. Let me just close all of these files. The first step, we tried to fetch our products in our home page. Let me just close all of this. So the first step was that we contacted Stripe and got a list of the prices that we had available from the products and provided this to our homepage, which rendered these components. We then added functionality to these components to be able to add items to products to shopping carts with the use of React context that shared the context of our shopping cart throughout our app. Now from this shopping cart slide over, we had this checkout button, which called this checkout function, and the checkout function called our own backend API Stripe sessions to create a session with this current items in it. Just to quickly review that, in the API, in the Stripe, in the sessions, index.js, this is the endpoint we had to create a session. We use this Stripe library to create a client and call this Stripe checkout sessions.create, pass it the line items existing in our shopping cart, selecting a payment mode, success URL, and a cancel URL to create a session. We then provided this session back to the client side. So that checkout function now has access to this session. It uses that session and the client side library from Stripe to then redirect the user to that created session so that they can pay. Once they pay, they're returned back to the success URL we defined before when we were creating this session, this success URL. They will be redirected back there, which is going to be this checkout success, from where we're just calling our own endpoint again for Stripe sessions. This time a dynamic endpoint. We are passing a session ID, so therefore we are getting the session ID from the URL parameters, and we are hitting this endpoint to retrieve the session, so we know, so we can show back a thank you page to the customer and say, hey, you purchased this product, this was the information. So if I go back to my APIs and this dynamic route or API route, what it does is that it extracts that session ID and calls the Stripe client this time to retrieve our session, and we again provide this session back to our client side. Our client side goes ahead and destructures information from it and shows it to our users. That's it for me, folks. I hope you learned how to use Stripe API with Next.js. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. And if you learned anything from this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps me create more contents like this. See you later. Bye-bye.